Okay, we have to get right into it because last World Cup, which you won, you were the coach of the team, and now you're living it a bit differently. How are you living this World Cup?
Through a very different lens, but loving it still the same. I mean, it's definitely, someone asked me the other day, do you have FOMO? I'm like, yeah, I guess I do a little bit. But listen, it's a spectacular event. It's everything, I imagined it to be. I always say every iteration of the Women's World Cup just continues to get better. And I think this one hasn't disappointed already with numbers and viewership, the competitiveness of the games. So, yeah, it's different. And I'm learning, when you're in it, you're in this bubble and you don't recognize all of the hype outside. And now I'm kind of seeing if I'd have known all the coverage and such, I probably would have rest, but it's all good.
Now, Jill, my wife, Yael Averbuch-West, actually one of your former players, has made the transition from on the pitch to behind the scenes. A little bit of a different transition for you, but how have you found it? What's been the most difficult part of not actually being able to set the tactics yourself?
Well, I mean, listen, you hire great people. Yes, and I've obviously know Yael very well, competed against her many times. But yeah, I mean, I think it's more you establish a framework. It's very much, I mean, you're a builder, really. When you're building a team or when you're building an organization, you've got to trust people, empower them, support them, and, give people resources to be successful. So it has, at times it's different. It's a different view. It's actually more stressful to be up in the stands than on the sidelines, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, I just, I think we've got a tremendous head coach and front office staff and GM. And so I've been able to just kind of be in a supportive role in that regard.
Jill, you mentioned the bubble. Everybody talks about the bubble when you're at the World Cup. Now that you're beyond it, you hear chatter now, right? You know what people are talking about. And after this game, the U.S. versus Netherlands, there were talks about coaching decisions. Now, I'm not going to go specifically to you about those coaching decisions, but I am going to say you've been a coach in these moments, and you have gotten to choose squads and starting 11s and substitutes. What goes into your mind as a coach when you're sitting there thinking, what substitutes can I use? Should I use? What are all the different factors that you have to put into those types of decisions?
Well, I think that the starting point for myself and my staff was we almost tried to have those decisions made, like regardless of a scenario. So we would actually, every morning of a game, we would meet and we would look at, because here's what happened, and you can appreciate this, right? You're on a sideline, you bring a player over, you're about to put him in, and then you're like watching the game, you're like, hang on a second.
Yeah.
The player is kind of in this in-between. So I remember after a game, we met as a staff and we basically said, let's eliminate the emotion from that, right? And let's try and make sure we have as many decisions made before the game starts. So we had a layout is if we're behind, what lineup do we want on the pitch? If we're ahead, how do we want to protect and preserve a lead? And you kind of have this already down. So I actually had almost like a cheat sheet, because when you're in the moment, you want to make sure you're leaning into decisions you made when you're not in that high pressure situation. So we did a lot of planning ahead of time. And certainly when it comes to, the minutes, knowing this is a 7-game tournament, you've got to think about, how do I take time off the players' legs? Meaning this many minutes as you start to build and go through. So it's a balance. You've got to get out of your group, but you also have to recognize to go the whole way, you've got to be measured in the minutes. So yeah, I think in that moment you have a plan about what the game needs. You bring in, we labeled them game changers a long time ago, but you bring in, and the important thing about the game changers is they're not there just to fill in. They are there to actually come in and impact the game in some capacity, whether it's just to score a goal, whether it's to preserve a lead, whatever situation you're in. So in those moments, yeah, we did a lot of forethought and planning before we got to that point.
Were the players privy to those types of changes, saying, hey, this could potentially be your role? Is that some of the things that you communicated with them when you were head coach?
Yes, I think, one of the things, because you have to understand with the players, I mean, it is an incredibly stressful moment to go into a world championship. So one of the things we tried to do was, I almost like to try and set a hierarchy at least 5 months before a major event. So players go in there and they know, hey, I'm either a game changer, I'm coming in, or they know, hey, I'm a starter. But I also think when you do that, you also make sure every player has the same information so that they can really execute the role. The last thing you want is a player that operates in a gray area where they're uncertain about what their role is. When you go into that hierarchy set, sure, you always plan to absorb injuries, But players, I think the more information they have, the more they can kind of settle into that decision and understand what their role and what's expected of them.
Jill, you coached me when I was super young, I think 14, 15, and you have the Jill Ellis Scholarship Foundation, which I've had the benefit of being a part of. This is the first World Cup where there's 32 teams, and we're seeing more female coaches that are coming into these high positions. Do you think the Federation's doing enough to promote female coaches up into these positions?
Well, listen, I think that was a step. I think with the scholarship, we wanted to try. We also created a mentorship program because it's not just getting women into sports or on the sidelines. It's how do you support them? How do they have a community when you're typically always in the minority? So that was a very passionate part of the programming. I think at every level, we can do more, meaning in the youth ranks. I mean, I actually think the numbers, when you go out on the sidelines of youth tournaments, there it's even more very obvious that there's hardly any female coaches coaching youth. And in fact, when I was the coach at UCLA, I used to have many players come that I was recruiting say, I've never been coached by a female. So I think we need to try and do more, even in the youth landscape, to get more coaches involved in that, make it a safe space for them, let them feel supported. And because it's usually a coach to get to the national team has to kind of go through a lot of different levels and get a lot of experiences. Well, sometimes if your first level starting in is coaching as a head coach of a college, you haven't really cut your teeth sometimes on some of the things you have to go through as a coach. So I think we can definitely do more.
Jill, back to this coaching aspect. I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. I think you said that 5 months ahead of time, you're making these decisions on who's starting the game and who's potentially a game changer. Is that correct?
Yeah, because I think so for example, I had a player named Carly Lloyd in 2015. Carly was
Oh yeah, I think I know her.
starter for us. She was, absolutely the mainstay of our team. And as we started to get through to 2019, the decision was that Carly was going to serve in a game changer role capacity. Well, you don't make that decision 2 weeks prior because, again, you want players to kind of settle into their role. Now, again, you've got to make sure that if you suddenly have an injury, you've even prepared for that. I mean, at the end of the day, going into a World Cup, it is so much of it is player management. It's it's managing the moment, it's managing the situation, the points. What do you need? It's even managing suspensions. If a player picks up 2 yellows and has to sit a game. But I think the more you can get ahead of that and kind of plan for those scenarios, the better. So, if you were to say to our players, hey, we're playing down a player, what shape are we going to be in? They'll know it. If you say, hey, we're behind, we've got to force a goal, there's 10 minutes left in the game, who do we want where? Yeah, they would typically know that because then it's they understand the roles and responsibilities that they're going into.
Jill, we got to talk about, you talked about player management there. Now you're in a different role with San Diego Wave as the president, a lot of management in different areas. Talk about this Wave squad, but I want to go specifically into one player because it's hard for me not to talk about her, Jaden Shaw, and just, do you see this player being a player that can really impact the women's national team at some point in her future?
I do. I mean, not to put pressure on Jaden, but 100%. I think, listen, I think Jaden is she's still a very young player, but she's got incredible instincts. A great first touch. She's got a savvy and a sophistication. She's got a lot to learn, but I just think overall, her awareness, her first touch, her understanding, even her versatility. We played Jaden Central. We played her wide. She's got a shot from distance. She can run at players. I do think she's going to have a very, very bright future, and I would probably say, yeah, before the next Olympics, I think she'll definitely have a look. Would be my guess.
I like it. I like it.
Love it.
Jill, I'm just fascinated by your planning ability and the fact that things are set so ahead of time. I'm thinking, I don't even know what I'm doing this weekend. After this conversation with Jill, I need to plan my calendar out for like the next few months and what I'm going to accomplish.
She said she has mentors, so you can
really
just get in a mentorship program.
Yeah, honestly, Jill, I'm going to have to give you a call.
I'm not that way. I'm not that way in my personal life. I'd be like, oh my God, horrified. But, I think if you were to ask our players in 2019, I mean, almost probably to a point that they were miserable because we would reinforce so many things. I was fortunate. I was at UCLA when Coach Wood, and he wasn't coaching at the time, I'm not that old, but he was there. And I always remember, him saying to me, it's one of his adages is if they haven't learned, you haven't taught. And so I think then it just made me kind of really realize that I have to constantly find ways to make sure players have understanding. And I think a good way, it's like us in our lives, right? If we know what's expected of us in our job, what's the roles or responsibilities, we're going to execute it better. So that's just kind of the approach I took. And I think even our players in 2019, they were kind of like, okay, we're ready to start because they felt so prepared. After the tournament, they literally said we were the most prepared team there. And that gives you confidence. So.
Oh, Jill, over preparation feels so good. I love that. When I'm a parent, if something happens that's wrong, I'm going to say I haven't taught them instead of blame them. We'll see if I stand to that because Aaron here is a parent and he's laughing at me right now. But Jill, thank you so much for joining us. That was fascinating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jill.
My pleasure.